The woman kneeling in the high mountain meadow didn't hear Tobias Northwood approach until his shadow fell across her sketchbook. And by then, it was too late to pretend she hadn't been trespassing on his land for the better part of 3 hours. Georgia Grant looked up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs as her eyes traveled from worn leather boots to buckskin-clad legs, up past a torso so broad and muscular it blocked out the afternoon sun, finally landing on a face that was equal parts handsome and intimidating. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his jaw was covered in several days' worth of stubble. His arms, visible beneath rolled sleeves, were corded with muscle that spoke of years spent living hard in these Colorado mountains. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, though it wasn't pointed at her. "I'm sorry," Georgia said quickly, scrambling to her feet and nearly dropping her charcoal pencils in the process. "I didn't think anyone lived up here. I'll leave right away." Tobias didn't speak immediately. His gray eyes moved from her face to the sketchbook. She clutched protectively against her chest, then to the wildflowers surrounding them in a riot of purple, yellow, and white. The meadow sat at nearly 10,000 feet, nestled between towering peaks, and the summer of 1876 had brought an especially abundant bloom. "What are you doing?" His voice was deep, rough from disuse, as though he didn't speak often. "Drawing," Georgia said, then realized how obvious that was. "The flowers. I'm documenting the native species for a botanical survey." His eyebrows rose slightly. "A what?" "I work for Professor Edmund Hartley at the Colorado College of Natural Sciences. We're cataloging the flora of the Rocky Mountains." She knew she was talking too fast, a nervous habit, but something about this man's intense presence made her want to fill the silence. "I've been staying in Granite for 2 months now, collecting specimens and making detailed illustrations. I didn't realize this meadow was private property. Most of the land around here is still public domain." "It's not," Tobias said. "Private, I mean. But I built my cabin on the far side, back against the ridge. Been living here 5 years. Oh," Georgia felt her cheeks warm. "I truly apologize. I'll find somewhere else to work." She started gathering her things, stuffing pencils into her leather satchel and carefully closing her sketchbook to protect the not quite dry drawings inside. When she straightened, the mountain man was still standing there, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You can stay," he said finally. "If you want." Georgia paused. "Are you certain? I don't want to intrude." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Already did that. Might as well finish your drawing." He turned and walked away before she could respond, his long strides carrying him across the meadow toward the tree line. Georgia stood there for a long moment, her heart still racing but no longer from fear. She'd been in Colorado territory since late April, and in that time she'd encountered plenty of rough men in Granite saloons and boarding houses. But none of them had affected her quite like Tobias Northwood, whose name she didn't even know yet. She settled back down among the flowers, opening her sketchbook to the half-finished illustration of a Colorado columbine. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up her charcoal pencil again, and she had to force herself to focus on the delicate curves of the petals rather than on the memory of gray eyes and broad shoulders. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the sky as Georgia worked, and she managed to complete 2 more detailed sketches before the light began to fade. She was just packing up when she heard footsteps again. This time, she wasn't startled. "These are good," Tobias said, and Georgia turned to find him looking over her shoulder at her open sketchbook. He'd approached more quietly than should have been possible for a man his size. "Real detailed. Thank you." Georgia felt a flutter of pride. Her illustrations were good, the result of years of practice and a genuine love for the natural world. It's important to be accurate for scientific purposes. You got a name, he asked, Georgia Grant, and you, Tobias Northwood. He shifted his weight, and Georgia noticed he'd left his rifle somewhere. You said you're staying in Granite, at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Georgia closed her sketchbook and slipped it into her satchel. It's a bit of a walk from there to here, but the Meadow is worth it. Was worth it, she corrected herself. I'll find another location tomorrow. Didn't say you couldn't come back. Georgia looked up at him, surprised. The setting sun turned his hair almost copper at the edges and softened the hard lines of his face. You're welcome to use the Meadow, he continued. Long as you want, flowers don't care who draws them. That's very kind of you, Mr. Northwood. Just Tobias. He glanced toward the darkening sky. It's a long walk back to town. You should start before it gets full dark. Mountain lions hunt at dusk. A chill ran down Georgia's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling air. She'd heard stories about the big cats, though she'd been fortunate enough not to encounter one yet. I'll hurry. I'll walk you to the trail head, Tobias said, in a tone that suggested it wasn't up for debate. They walked together through the meadow and into the forest, following a narrow path that wound between pine and aspen trees. Georgia was acutely aware of Tobias beside her, his presence somehow both comforting and unsettling. He moved through the wilderness like he was part of it, each step sure and silent. How did you end up living out here? She asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to break the silence. Came west after the war, Tobias said. Tried mining for a while down in California and then in Nevada. Didn't take to it. Too many people, too much noise. Heard about good trapping in Colorado, came up here in '71. Found the Meadow and decided to stay. Don't you get lonely? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Sometimes, he said finally, but I got used to my own company. It's simpler. Georgia understood that more than he probably knew. She'd spent most of her 22 years as the odd one out, more interested in plants and scientific journals than in the social pursuits expected of young women. Working for Professor Hartley was a dream come true, even if it meant spending months at a time in rough frontier towns, far from the comforts of Denver. They reached the point where the narrow path joined the main trail leading down to Granite. The town was still a good hour's walk away, but the trail was well maintained and wide enough that Georgia felt safe traveling alone. Thank you for escorting me, she said, and for allowing me to work in your meadow. Tobias nodded. You'll come back tomorrow. The question caught her off guard, mostly because he sounded like he actually wanted her to return. If you truly don't mind. I don't mind. He paused, then added, it was nice, having someone there. Georgia smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. Then yes, I'll come back tomorrow. She walked down the mountain trail as darkness gathered around her, her mind full of wildflowers and gray eyes, and a mountain man who lived alone by choice, but perhaps wasn't quite as content with solitude as he claimed. When Georgia climbed back up to the meadow the next morning, the sun barely above the eastern peaks, she found a small bouquet of freshly picked wildflowers laid carefully on the flat rock where she'd worked the previous day. The arrangement included samples of every species she'd been sketching, their stems still wet with dew. Her breath caught in her throat as she picked up the bouquet, marveling at how carefully they'd been selected. Each flower was perfect, unblemished, chosen with an eye for both beauty and botanical interest. She looked around the meadow but saw no sign of Tobias. Georgia settled onto the rock and carefully arranged the flowers beside her, using them as fresh models for her work. As she drew, she found herself smiling for no particular reason, her pencil moving with unusual confidence across the paper. She worked for several hours, completing detailed studies of mountain bluebells, alpine forget-me-nots, and a particularly striking specimen of scarlet gilia. Around midday, when the sun was high and hot, she heard the distinctive sound of someone chopping wood in the distance. The rhythmic thud of an axe biting into timber carried across the meadow, and Georgia found herself wondering about the cabin she hadn't yet seen, hidden somewhere beyond the trees. When the light began to shift toward late afternoon, Georgia packed up her supplies and walked toward the sound of the axe. She found Tobias behind a neat log cabin built against the sheltering wall of the mountain ridge. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, and Georgia had to force herself not to stare at the play of muscle across his back and shoulders as he swung the axe with practiced precision. Wood chips flew with each strike, and a substantial pile of split logs was already stacked against the cabin wall. He must have sensed her presence because he paused mid-swing and turned. Sweat glistened on his chest, and his hair was tied back with a leather cord. Georgia felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "I wanted to thank you," she said, holding up one of the flowers he'd left. "For the specimens. They were perfect." Tobias set down the axe and reached for a shirt draped over a nearby stump, pulling it on with economical movements. "Figured it would save you time having them already picked." "It did. I finished more drawings today than I usually manage in 2 days." Georgia took a few steps closer, curiosity overcoming shyness. "Your cabin is lovely. Did you build it yourself?" "Yeah, took most of a winter, but I had time." He gestured toward the structure. "Want to see inside?" The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. Everything was meticulously organized and surprisingly clean for a bachelor's home. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with cooking implements hung neatly nearby. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly crafted by Tobias himself. What caught Georgia's attention, however, was the bookshelf beside the window. "You read," she said, surprised and immediately embarrassed by her tone. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound shocked. It's all right." Most folks assume mountain men are illiterate. Tobias moved to stand beside her, and Georgia was acutely aware of how much space he took up, how his presence seemed to fill the cabin. "My mother was a school teacher back in Missouri. She made sure I got educated before the war." Georgia scanned the titles, classics like Milton and Shakespeare, but also more recent works by Mark Twain and Bret Harte. A well-worn copy of Walden sat at eye level. "We have similar taste," she said. "I adore Thoreau." "Nature and solitude," Tobias said, "seemed fitting." They talked about books for a while, standing in the cabin as afternoon light streamed through the window. Georgia learned that Tobias had been 20 when he enlisted in the Union Army, that he'd seen action at Shiloh and Vicksburg, that he'd come home to find his parents dead from cholera, and nothing left to tie him to Missouri. The West had called to him like it called to so many broken men seeking a fresh start. "I should head back to town," Georgia said eventually, reluctant despite the practical need to leave before dark. "But I'd like to come again tomorrow if that's still acceptable. I'll walk you down." It became a pattern over the following days. Georgia would arrive at the meadow in the morning to find fresh flowers waiting for her, each bouquet more thoughtfully arranged than the last. She would work through the day, sketching and occasionally taking notes for Professor Hartley's survey. Sometimes Tobias would appear and they would talk. Other times she would work in solitude, aware of his presence somewhere nearby but respecting the distance. In the evenings, before walking her down to the trail head, Tobias would show her different aspects of mountain life. He taught her to identify animal tracks in the soft earth, to recognize the warning chatter of chipmunks when predators were near, to find the best wild strawberry patches hidden among the rocks. Georgia absorbed it all with the same enthusiasm she brought to her botanical work, genuinely fascinated by this world so different from her academic life in Denver. On the fifth day, as they walked together through the forest, Georgia asked about the rifle Tobias always carried. "Have you had to use it often? For protection, I mean?" "Sometimes, mostly for hunting." He paused at a stream to let her drink from the cold, clear water. "Had a run-in with a bear last spring. She had cubs, came too close to the cabin, fired a warning shot, and she moved on." "You didn't shoot her, didn't need to. She was just protecting her young." Tobias's expression softened. "Can't fault a mother for that." Georgia found herself watching him more closely as the days passed. She noticed how gentle his hands were despite their size and calluses, how he moved through the world with quiet confidence, how his rare smiles transformed his entire face. She noticed, too, how he'd started to spend more time in the meadow when she was there, finding reasons to be nearby. He'd bring her water from his well, or share his midday meal of bread and dried meat, or simply sit at a respectful distance and watch her work. 2 weeks after their first meeting, Georgia was sketching a cluster of Indian paintbrush when Tobias approached carrying a wooden box. "Made something for you," he said, sounding almost shy. Inside the box was a complete set of compartments, perfectly sized for her pencils, charcoals, and other supplies. The wood was sanded smooth as glass and fitted together with obvious expertise. On the lid, he'd carved a simple design of wildflowers. "Tobias, this is beautiful," Georgia breathed, running her fingers over the carving. "You didn't have to do this. Saw you struggling with that cloth bag, thought this might be better." Their eyes met, and something passed between them that made Georgia's pulse quicken. She was suddenly very aware that they were alone in the meadow, that granite was miles away, that Tobias was looking at her like she was something precious. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." The next morning, Georgia arrived to find not just flowers but a small feast laid out on her rock. Fresh bread, butter wrapped in cloth, a jar of wild honey, and a handful of perfect strawberries. Tobias emerged from the tree line as she was staring at it all in wonder. "Figured you might want breakfast," he said. "It's a long climb from town." They ate together in the morning sunlight, talking easily now as they'd grown more comfortable with each other. Georgia told him about growing up in Denver, about her father's disapproval of her scientific pursuits, about how Professor Hartley had been the first person to take her ambition seriously. Tobias listened with full attention, asking questions that showed he genuinely cared about her answers. "Your pa sounds like a fool," he said finally, "trying to keep you from something you're clearly meant to do. He thinks a woman's place is in the home, that I should focus on finding a husband rather than studying botany." "And what do you think?" Georgia met his gaze steadily. "I think women can want more than one thing. I think we're capable of having both meaningful work and meaningful relationships if we find partners who respect us." "Seems reasonable to me." Tobias reached for another strawberry, then offered it to her instead. "Though I suspect your pa wouldn't approve of me either. Mountain hermit with no prospects." "You have more prospects than most men I've met," Georgia said, accepting the fruit. "You're self-sufficient, skilled, intelligent. You've read more books than half the supposedly educated men in Denver. And you're kind, which counts for more than any of them realize." Something flickered in Tobias's eyes. "You think I'm kind? I know you are. These past weeks, the flowers, the box, sharing your meadow and your time. Yes, Tobias, you're the kindest man I've ever known." He looked away, but not before she saw the emotion cross his face. "Been a long time since anyone said something like that to me." Georgia felt a surge of tenderness so strong it almost hurt. She reached out without thinking and touched his hand where it rested on the rock between them. His fingers were rough and warm, and they curled around hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. They sat like that for a long moment, hands intertwined, neither speaking. The meadow sang with birdsong and the buzz of insects moving among the flowers. A breeze carried the scent of pine and sun-warmed grass. Georgia felt something fundamental shift inside her, a recognition that her life had just divided into before and after this moment. "I should work," she said eventually, though she made no move to pull away. "Professor Hartley expects detailed reports every 2 weeks and I'm behind schedule. Because you've been spending time with me. Because I've wanted to spend time with you." Tobias's thumb traced a gentle circle on the back of her hand. "I'm glad you found my meadow, Georgia Grant. So am I." As July deepened into August, the relationship between Georgia and Tobias deepened too. She began arriving earlier and staying later, pushing the boundaries of safe travel time because she couldn't bear to leave. Tobias started accompanying her all the way back to town, claiming it was for her safety, but really, they both knew, because neither of them was ready to say goodbye. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house proprietor, had noticed the change in her lodger. "You've been glowing lately, dear," she said one evening as Georgia returned just before full dark. "That mountain air must agree with you." "It does," Georgia said, unable to keep the smile from her face. "Or maybe it's not the air at all," Mrs. Henderson said knowingly. "There's a man, isn't there?" Georgia felt her cheeks warm. "I'm conducting botanical research." "Oh, I'm sure you are, but research doesn't usually put that look in a girl's eyes." The older woman's expression softened. "Be careful, dear. These mountain men can be rough types." "Not this one," Georgia said quietly. "He's nothing like you'd expect." She was right. Tobias defied every expectation Georgia had held about men like him. Yes, he was strong and capable, able to survive in conditions that would kill softer men. But he was also thoughtful and careful, attentive to her needs and her moods in ways that constantly surprised her. He noticed when she was tired and would insist she rest. He remembered details from conversations days earlier. He treated her artistic work with a respect and reverence that even Professor Hartley sometimes failed to show. And he touched her like she was made of spun glass, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such large, work-roughened hands. It started with small things, helping her across streams, steadying her arm when she lost her balance on uneven ground, brushing a stray leaf from her hair. But it progressed, gradually, into more intimate gestures, his arm around her waist as they walked, her head on his shoulder as they rested in the meadow, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw as they said goodbye each evening. One afternoon in mid-August, as storm clouds gathered over the peaks, Tobias pulled Georgia close and kissed her for the first time. It was soft and questioning at first, giving her the chance to pull away. Instead, she pressed closer, rising on her toes to deepen the kiss, her hands sliding up his chest to curl around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Then why did you wait so long?" Georgia asked, half laughing, half breathless. "Didn't want to presume. Didn't want to push you into something you didn't want." He pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "You're educated, cultured. You could have any man you wanted. Why would you choose someone like me?" "Because you're exactly the man I want, Tobias Northwood. Exactly." The storm broke overhead, sending them running for the cabin. They tumbled inside laughing, soaked through and exhilarated. Tobias built up the fire while Georgia hung her shawl to dry, and they ended up sitting close together on his simple bed, watching rain hammer against the window. "You'll have to stay until it passes," Tobias said. "Can't walk down in this weather." "I know." Georgia leaned against him, feeling safe and warm despite her wet clothes. "Tell me something, Tobias. If you could have anything in the world, what would you want?" He was quiet for a long moment, his arm heavy and comforting around her shoulders. "Used to be I'd say I wanted to be left alone to live out my days in peace without the complications of the world. But that was before." "Before what?" "Before you showed up in my meadow with your sketchbook and your questions about flowers." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes intense. "Now what I want is for you to stay. Not just today, not just for the summer. I want you to stay here with me, Georgia. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here, that I get to see you smile, that I get to bring you flowers for the rest of my life if that's what makes you happy." Georgia's heart felt too large for her chest. "That's what you want. That's what I want. But I know it's not fair to ask. You have your work, your life in Denver. I'm just a man living in the wilderness with nothing to offer but a small cabin and a meadow full of wildflowers." "You're offering everything that matters," Georgia said fiercely. She turned to face him fully, taking his face between her hands. "I love you, Tobias. I've loved you since you left those first flowers for me, since you carved me that beautiful box. Since you looked at my drawings like they were the most important thing in the world. I don't care about fancy houses or city life. I care about you. You love me, with everything I am." He kissed her again, harder this time, with an urgency born of weeks of restraint breaking all at once. Georgia melted into him, her fingers tangling in his long hair, her body responding to his touch with an intensity that should have frightened her but didn't. This was right. This was exactly where she was meant to be when they broke apart again. Both knew they'd crossed an invisible line. "Marry me," Tobias said, the words tumbling out like he couldn't hold them back. "I know it's fast, I know you probably think I'm crazy, but marry me, Georgia. Let me spend my life making you happy." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." The rain continued through the evening, making it impossible for Georgia to return to town. Tobias was the perfect gentleman, insisting she take the bed while he made up a pallet by the fire. But they talked long into the night, making plans and dreaming aloud about their future together. "I'll need to write to Professor Hartley," Georgia said. "I can still complete my surveys from here. The mountains are full of species I haven't documented yet. And perhaps I can take on other work, illustrations for botanical journals, things I can do from anywhere." "We'll make it work," Tobias assured her. "Whatever you need, we'll make it work." They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who passed through Granite once a month. Mrs. Henderson and a handful of townspeople attended, though Georgia noticed the curious and sometimes disapproving looks. She didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. She knew the truth of what she and Tobias had found together. Tobias wore clean clothes and had trimmed his beard, though he still looked every inch the mountain man. Georgia wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that matched the mountain bluebells. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Tobias kissed her with such tender reverence that she felt tears prick her eyes. They walked back up to the meadow together that evening, Georgia's few belongings packed on a mule Tobias had borrowed from a friendly homesteader. The cabin felt different now, transformed from a bachelor's shelter into a home. Their home. That first night as husband and wife was everything Georgia had secretly hoped for and more. Tobias was patient and gentle, taking his time to learn what pleased her, murmuring words of love and reassurance as they came together. Georgia had read enough medical texts to understand the mechanics of intimacy, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional intensity of it, the feeling of complete connection as their bodies moved together in the lamplight. Afterward, wrapped in Tobias's arms with her head on his chest, Georgia felt a peace she'd never known before. This was right. This was home. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Georgia continued her botanical work, now with Tobias as an eager assistant. He had an excellent eye for spotting rare species, and would often come home from his hunting trips with carefully wrapped specimens for her to study. Together, they explored higher elevations, finding alpine meadows where flowers grew that couldn't survive at lower altitudes. Georgia also discovered that she enjoyed the domestic aspects of their life together. She learned to cook over the open fire, to preserve wild berries and make jam, to help Tobias prepare for the coming winter. He taught her to split wood, to identify edible plants, to read weather signs in the behavior of animals and the patterns of clouds. "You're turning into a mountain woman," he teased one afternoon as she successfully shot a grouse for their dinner. "Is that a compliment or a complaint?" she asked, laughing. "Pure admiration." He pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "You amaze me every day, Georgia Northwood." She loved hearing her new name, loved belonging to this man and this place so completely. Her father had sent one terse letter in response to her announcement of her marriage, expressing his disappointment that she'd thrown away her potential on a common trapper. Georgia had written back calmly, explaining that she'd found exactly what she wanted and wouldn't apologize for choosing love and happiness over society's narrow expectations. Professor Hartley, by contrast, was delighted. He wrote enthusiastically about the possibilities for long-term field research, encouraged her to continue her work, and even raised her compensation, saying her detailed illustrations from the high country were the best he'd received from any of his researchers. As September arrived and the aspen began to turn gold, Georgia realized she'd missed her monthly courses. She said nothing at first, not wanting to get Tobias's hopes up until she was certain. But when October came and still nothing happened, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. Georgia told Tobias one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. "I'm going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his face for his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, as though he couldn't quite process the words. Then joy broke across his features like sunrise. "A baby." "We're having a baby." "Yes." Georgia laughed as he pulled her into his arms, holding her with careful strength. "Sometime in late spring, I think. A baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. "Georgia, I don't even know what to say. You're happy." Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright. "We're going to be a family." They spent the rest of the evening making plans. Tobias would build a cradle, add onto the cabin to create more space. Georgia would need to stock up on supplies before winter made travel difficult. They'd need to find a midwife willing to come up the mountain when the time came, or arrange for Georgia to stay in town for the birth. "I want to stay here," Georgia said firmly. "I want our child born in this place we love, in our home. It might not be safe, Mrs. Henderson told me about Martha Davis, the midwife who lives on the far side of Granite. She delivered half the babies in this county. If we talk to her now, explain the situation, I'm sure she'd be willing to come when the time is right." Tobias was reluctant, but eventually agreed. The next day they rode down to Granite together and found Martha Davis, a capable woman in her 50s with strong hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to their request, asked Georgia a series of direct questions about her health, then nodded. "I'll come when you need me," she said. "Send word when the time is close, and I'll ride up. Done it before for homesteaders in worse situations than yours." Winter came to the high country with a vengeance. Snow began falling in earnest in November and didn't let up until the meadow was blanketed in white 3 feet deep. Tobias had prepared well, though. The cabin was snug and well insulated, their stores of food were plentiful, and they had enough firewood stacked to last through multiple winters. Being snowed in together only deepened their bond. They spent long evenings reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about everything and nothing. Tobias worked on the cradle and other baby furniture while Georgia sorted through her botanical samples and worked on illustrations by lamplight. Her belly grew slowly but steadily, and Tobias was constantly amazed by it, often resting his hand against her stomach to feel the baby move. "You hope for a boy or a girl?" Georgia asked one night as they lay in bed. Tobias's hand splayed across her belly. "Don't care," he said honestly. "Long as you're both healthy, that's all that matters to me. But if you could choose," he was quiet for a moment. "A boy would be practical, I suppose, someone to teach hunting and tracking to help with the heavy work as he grows. But a girl—" His voice softened. "A little girl with your eyes and your curiosity about the world. That would be something special." "What if we have both eventually?" Georgia asked, smiling in the darkness. "A whole brood of children running through the meadow. I'd like that. I'd like that very much." Christmas came, and Tobias surprised Georgia by producing gifts he'd been secretly working on for weeks. A rocking chair perfectly sized for nursing. A soft blanket woven from wool he'd traded for in town. A pair of tiny moccasins that made Georgia cry with their tender perfection. "When did you learn to make baby shoes?" she asked through her tears. "Watched my mother do it once for my little brother. He didn't live past his first winter." Tobias's voice was rough with old grief, but I remembered how she did it. "Wanted to make something for our child, something from my own hands." Georgia held the moccasins against her chest and pulled Tobias close. "They're perfect. Everything is perfect. I never imagined I could be this happy." "Neither did I." He kissed her slowly, thoroughly. "You saved me, Georgia. I was just existing up here, waiting for my life to run out. Then you showed up with your sketchbook and reminded me what it feels like to be alive." The months crawled by with the slow patience of winter, but finally, spring began to assert itself. The snow receded gradually, revealing muddy ground and the first brave shoots of new growth. Georgia's belly was enormous now, making movement difficult. She spent most of her time in the cabin, reading or working on simple sewing projects while Tobias brought her anything she needed. In late April, when the meadow was just beginning to show patches of green among the lingering snow, Georgia felt the first contractions. Tobias rode down the mountain immediately, returning a few hours later with Martha Davis and her medical supplies. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through an entire day and into the following night. Tobias stayed by Georgia's side the whole time, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her forehead, murmuring encouragement even though he looked terrified. Martha was calm and efficient, guiding Georgia through each contraction with practical instructions. "Almost there," Martha said as the night deepened toward dawn. "Next push should do it." Georgia bore down with the last of her strength, and suddenly there was release and the thin, angry cry of a newborn. "It's a boy," Martha announced, holding up the squirming infant. "A big, healthy boy." Tobias made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob as Martha cleaned the baby and placed him in Georgia's arms. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. Georgia felt love so overwhelming it threatened to drown her. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." "He's beautiful," Tobias breathed, touching one tiny hand with a finger. The baby's fingers closed around Tobias's, gripping with surprising strength. "He's perfect." They named him Thomas after Tobias's father. Martha stayed for 3 days to make sure both mother and baby were doing well, then headed back to Granite with payment in the form of furs and dried meat. She left with instructions for Georgia's recovery and a promise to check on them in a few weeks. Those first days with Thomas were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding, but Georgia had never been happier. Tobias was a devoted father, always ready to walk the floor with a crying baby or change soiled cloths without complaint. He'd sing old songs in his rough voice, lullabies his mother had sung to him, and Thomas would quiet and stare up at his father with solemn eyes. As spring progressed into summer, Georgia gradually returned to her botanical work, though now with Thomas strapped to her back in a carrier Tobias had fashioned. She would sit in the meadow where they'd first met, sketching flowers while her son napped, and feel such contentment it was almost painful. "You ever miss city life?" Tobias asked one evening as they sat outside the cabin, watching the sun set over the peaks. Thomas was asleep in his cradle nearby, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers. "Never," Georgia said honestly. "This is everything I need. You, Thomas, this place. I wouldn't trade it for all the libraries and lecture halls in the world. Not even for easier living. For neighbors and society and all the things women are supposed to want." Georgia turned to look at him fully. "Tobias Northwood, how many times do I have to tell you? I'm not like other women. I never have been. I don't want what they want. I want this life with you exactly as it is." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I love you, Georgia. I love you too." The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their family. Georgia continued her botanical work, producing illustrations and papers that earned her recognition in scientific circles, though she never sought the spotlight. Professor Hartley eventually retired and named Georgia as his successor, though she declined the formal position, preferring to work independently from her mountain home. When Thomas was 3, they welcomed a daughter they named Grace. She had her mother's curiosity and her father's calm demeanor, and from the time she could walk, she followed Tobias everywhere, determined to learn everything he knew about the wilderness. 2 years after Grace came another son, Timothy, who was loud and adventurous and kept them constantly on their toes. And 3 years after that, when Georgia was 30, came their last child, a daughter they named Lily, who was as delicate and lovely as the flowers she was named for. The cabin expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family. Tobias added rooms and a proper second floor, transforming the simple shelter into a real home. Georgia planted a garden where she grew vegetables and herbs, and Tobias built a larger barn for the horses and mules they'd acquired. They weren't completely isolated. Other families had homesteaded in the surrounding mountains, and there was a small community that gathered for celebrations and mutual support. Their children played with other mountain kids, learning to read from Georgia and survival skills from Tobias and the other men who'd made their lives in the high country. But the meadow remained their special place. Even as the children grew and life became more complicated, Georgia and Tobias would steal moments there together. Tobias never stopped bringing her flowers, a bouquet left on their dining table or tucked into her work satchel. It was his way of saying what he sometimes struggled to put into words, that she was still the most precious thing in his world. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Tobias led Georgia up to the meadow in the early morning, asking her to bring her sketchbook like she had that first day. When they arrived, she found he'd created a small shelter there, a simple structure with a roof and open sides where she could work protected from sun or rain. "I thought you might like a proper place for your art," he said, suddenly shy despite 2 decades of marriage. "Somewhere you can work without worrying about the weather." Georgia felt tears prick her eyes as she explored the shelter. He'd even built a proper desk and shelves for her supplies. "Tobias, this is wonderful. When did you have time to build this?" Been working on it for months whenever I could slip away without you noticing." He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You gave up so much to be here with me, Georgia. I wanted to give you something back." "I didn't give up anything," she protested, turning in his arms. "I gained everything. But this is beautiful, and I'll treasure it." They made love in the meadow that morning with the ease and familiarity of long practice, but also with the passion that had never quite faded between them. Afterward, lying in the grass with Tobias's arms around her, Georgia thought about how far they'd come from that first day when she'd been a trespasser and he'd been a lonely hermit. "You remember what you said that first day?" she asked. "That the flowers didn't care who drew them." "I remember. I think you were wrong. I think they brought us together on purpose. I think this meadow knew we belonged here together." Tobias laughed, the sound warm and rich. "That's poets' talk, maybe, but it's also true. Their children grew into capable young adults." Thomas became a surveyor, using his knowledge of the mountains to help map the territories for the government. Grace married a teacher from Granite and had children of her own, though she never moved far from the mountains she loved. Timothy went east for college, drawn to the wider world but always returning home for long summers. Lily became a botanical illustrator like her mother, eventually publishing a book of Colorado wildflowers that became the definitive reference for the region. Tobias and Georgia grew older together with Grace. His hair turned silver but remained long, and he stayed strong and capable well into his 60s. Georgia's face gained lines, but her eyes stayed bright with curiosity and love. They still walked the mountain trails together, still sat in the meadow shelter while she sketched, still ended each day grateful for the life they'd built. On a summer morning when Tobias was 68 and Georgia was 66, they walked up to the meadow together just after dawn. The flowers were at their peak, a riot of color that had changed very little in the 44 years since they'd first met. Tobias had picked a bouquet before they left the house, and he presented it to Georgia with the same slightly shy smile he'd worn as a younger man. "Still bringing me flowers," she said, accepting them with delight. "Always," he promised. "For as long as I'm able." They sat together in the shelter he'd built, Georgia sketching while Tobias simply watched her work. It was peaceful, perfect, the culmination of a life well lived together. "Do you have any regrets?" Tobias asked suddenly. Georgia looked up from her drawing, considering the question seriously. "None, not a single one. You. Only that I didn't find you sooner." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining like they had that first time decades ago. "But maybe it happened exactly when it was supposed to. Maybe we both needed to become the people we were before we could find each other." "I think you're right." Georgia set aside her sketchbook and moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "This life, this love, it's been everything I could have wanted and more." "Same for me. You made me human again, Georgia, gave me a reason to care about the world." They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun move across the meadow, listening to birdsong and the whisper of wind through grass. Around them, the flowers nodded and swayed, the same species that had brought them together all those years ago, still blooming, still beautiful, still bearing witness to the love story that had unfolded in their midst. Eventually, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, ready to face whatever time remained to them together. The meadow would be there tomorrow and the day after that, waiting with fresh flowers and old memories, a testament to the moment when a lonely mountain man had found a woman sketching in his private paradise and decided to pick her fresh flowers every morning after that, a simple gesture that had blossomed into the greatest love either of them had ever known. Their story became the stuff of local legend in Granite and the surrounding settlements. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren would beg to hear about how their grandmother had trespassed in a hidden meadow, and their grandfather had wooed her with wildflowers. The tale was told and retold, embellished and simplified, but the heart of it remained true. Two people who'd found exactly what they needed in each other and built a life of genuine contentment in the wild beauty of the Colorado mountains. Years later, long after both Tobias and Georgia had passed peacefully in their sleep on the same winter night, as though neither could bear to exist without the other, their descendants maintained the cabin and the meadow. The shelter Tobias had built for Georgia's work was preserved, and family members would still leave fresh flowers there in summer, honoring the tradition he'd started so long ago. The meadow itself seemed to bloom more abundantly than any other place in the mountains, as though the land itself remembered the love that had flourished there. Botanists came from across the country to study the unusual diversity of species, never quite able to explain why this particular patch of earth was so extraordinarily fertile and alive. But the Northwood family knew the truth, or at least the truth as they understood it. That love, real and true and freely given, has a way of making everything around it more beautiful, more vital, more permanent than stone or steel could ever be. And on summer mornings, if you arrived at the meadow early enough, when the dew still clung to the petals and the sun was just cresting the eastern peaks, you could almost see them there. A broad-shouldered man with silver hair and a woman with a sketchbook, sitting close together and simply being, the way they had been for more than 40 years of marriage, the way they would be in memory and story for generations to come. Their love story, born from wildflowers and nurtured by daily acts of devotion, had become part of the landscape itself, as enduring as the mountains and as beautiful as the blooms that returned faithfully every spring. A reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest moments, that sometimes all it takes is picking someone fresh flowers to show them they matter, to tell them without words that they've been seen and valued and cherished. Tobias and Georgia Northwood had found something precious in that mountain meadow, something worth more than gold or status or any of the things the world told them they should want. They'd found each other, and in finding each other, they'd found home, purpose, joy, and a love that lasted beyond their lifetimes, written in the ground itself, blooming anew with every spring, eternal as the wildflowers that had witnessed it all from the very beginning.